grew up in Southgate. Nobody anymore has heard about the Southgate Brethren Church, but a lot of missionaries left that church.
I am a farmer's daughter. I lived all my life in the country, went to rural schools until high school when a bus went around the country picking up all us country kids to take us into town for high school.
So when I went to sea at 17 years of age during World War II, I was wondering where my mission field was going to be, following the good example of the predecessors. But I wanted to go to where somebody hadn't been. The ship put in at Pearl Harbor because we had a sailor that was sick with jaundice and a radio receiver that wasn't working anymore, and I was one of the radio operators aboard, so we wanted our radios to work. And after a few days there, I observed that churches are all over town. We sailed out west again towards Leyte in the Philippines, anchored in Lingayen Gulf, later loaded ammunition at Pier 1 in Manila, and all of these places had their churches already, so I hadn't found my mission field yet.
Just before graduating from the 8th grade, our teacher called each of us 8th graders into his office one by one to ask us about our future plans. I had known this teacher for 3 years as the teacher for the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. That shows you how big our school was not. Besides that, he was our neighbor for a time, and we grew up with his girls. And he was also a member of the same church we attended. So he knew me pretty well. He asked my plans for the future. I had my plans all made. I was going to be a librarian. Not that I knew anything about the work of a librarian, but I loved to read, and I had never been in a situation where there were enough books available to satisfy me, so I thought being a librarian would be just the thing. One of the courses I took the first year in high school was library science, and I didn't like it. I got my lowest grades in that class, and it wasn't because of the teacher. She was my ideal of a young teacher, a young woman, but already the Lord was preparing something else for me.
And one of the trips in February of 1947, we had a cargo for the middle of Argentina. The ship going through these islands all day long, only could see jungle, 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 jungle. No clearings, no evidence of anybody being down there. It was after supper. I was out on the starboard boat deck. The sky was getting darker and darker. And I heard some sounds that changed my direction. I heard kids laughing and dogs barking. Couldn't see anything. It was jungle. But I realized that people must live down under those trees. We have since then found out that it's necessary to pay to make a clearing, to make a open area to build a home, like we did to build this home here. All this was jungle when we moved in, or when we bought the place, and in other places that we bought and lived. And it takes money to open up an area to make this slash and burn agriculture that we use here in South America, that they use. So these people must be dirt poor. I'm looking for a mission field. Nobody here is going to paddle a canoe 100 miles downstream to Buenos Aires or another 100 miles upstream to Rosario. To hear the gospel. And if they did, they wouldn't have the clothes to wear to one of these beautiful churches. So if they're going to hear, somebody has to go to them. I slept on it that night, probably prayed before I went to bed. Probably got down on my knees on the steel deck there in the stateroom. The next morning went to Radio Shack and radioed the steamship company office in New York, asking them to relieve me when possible, because I had decided to leave the sea and go to a Bible school in Los Angeles.
The Evangelical Free Church in another city sent some missionaries to our little town to work with the Mexican immigrants who came in as farm workers during the summer and early fall months. Because they started their work as a Sunday school, the adults were free at worship service time and were looking for a church and came to ours. And I became acquainted with them. About the same time, the first and only missionary that I ever heard came to our church. Because she represented Africa, I felt that that's where the Lord was calling me, to Africa. Then when these folks came to work with the Mexicans, I talked with them one day about my thoughts about being a missionary and what should I do and how do I go about it. Their idea was to begin working with them. These dear folks gave me lots of advice, and they also gave me the opportunity of beginning to work with someone of a different language by working in their Sunday school. I didn't know enough Spanish to teach in Spanish and Mexican, but I taught the younger children who knew English. So for the last 3 years of high school, on Sunday morning I would go there for Sunday school and they would bring me back to church. We became very good friends. During the years that followed, each time there was some important decision to make, the Lord brought another individual into my life to direct me to the right place. When it was time to consider Bible school, a young man from the church who had graduated from Biola came home to visit his parents and gave me all the information I needed, and that got me started there. So this country girl went from the country to the city of Los Angeles and spent 3 years there at the Bible Institute of Los Angeles.
So I went to school, fall of 1947, Bible Institute of Los Angeles. 1,000 students, all of the guys were GIs, returning from the war. We had our eyes open, and there were 500 girls there, 500 guys. And I saw mine, the first class, the first day.
After 4 years at Winona Lake, we were accepted as missionaries there. Had some wonderful people counseling us and helping us. I think we were probably the last of a dying breed at that time. We did not have any special training after seminary. We didn't have to raise our own support. We didn't have any language study. Bill graduated in May, and by August we were in Brazil. Don't think that happens anymore. We felt that it was a blessing of the Lord that it was that way. While we were in seminary, we met Jack and Jean Velasco, who were also headed for Brazil. We had some good fellowship with them. They came ahead of us and were here to greet us, to help us to get oriented, and had arranged a place for us to live and a language teacher by the time we arrived. We brought 2 small children with us. One was 2.5 and the other was 8 months old when we arrived in Brazil.
Sailed out of Brooklyn on my birthday, the 5th of August, 27 years old, in 1954, and have lived here happily ever since. This is our 50th year in Brazil. Spent the first year in Iquaracy learning the language.
Patience of the Brazilian with our limited Portuguese, we really only understood after some years. We thought we were doing pretty well, but I think they must have had to really concentrate and think and try to decide what it was we were trying to say. But they were very gracious and very helpful to us.
I remember one of our field council meetings shortly thereafter. My colleagues complained with me, Bill. They said, we observed that you're spending more time out in the islands than pastoring your local church. Well, that was an accusation I couldn't deny. And eventually I moved to one of the islands, with their blessing, of course, and began the island work. The island work was begun while we were still living in Equator Sea. Jack and I built our first boat in 1954 still. Churches were established out in the islands in the 1950s that are still going. One of them has grown sufficiently, the one on Monkey Island, that it was able to house this year the national conference of all the brethren churches in Brazil. Beautiful church building built up on a fluvial island on stilts. From there we moved to Coachipuru in 1954. Spent 5 years there. And the result is that there's the church in Coachipuru, there's a church in Agua Boa, there's a meeting in pastor's home in Primavera, the county seat, and another brick church building that the people from Agua Boa have built out on a beach town called Boa Vista.
Probably the biggest problem isn't the right word, perhaps challenge, is that of any mother with young children, how to balance being a mother and being a missionary. Especially when, as the children got old enough, I was their teacher as well.
We moved from there to the Guama River. My older son Art and I put an inflatable boat we had in the water, a Zodiac with an outboard motor, and traveled 40 miles of the river from the town of San Miguel that our kids called St. Mike, 40 miles down to the town of San Domingos. And we found somebody willing to sell a piece of property midway along. One day I would go downstream, and the next day we'd go upstream.
Normally, wherever we lived, Bill would take one weekday and stay home so that he could watch the children while I would go visiting the women here and there. It seemed like eventually, but it wasn't really all that many years until the children no longer needed me in that way, and I was free to go spend my time with the individual women. Almost all of my ministry has been on a one-on-one or small group situation.
The initial phase for about a year, I suppose, on the Guama River, we were there 10 years, from 70 to 80, was evangelism. One day, as I indicated, I'd go downstream, the next day upstream. On regular days of the week, so the people would get acquainted with my schedule and know when approximately I would be there and what time of the day, which day of the week. Anytime I'd see a man, I'd go ashore. I'd never stop or wave or even look hard at a house where there was just a woman and kids. But if we'd see a man, I had no way to know what kind of a man he was, and whether he was the man of the house or not, but I'd pull in if I saw a man. So that right from the beginning, they learned my funny ways. And therefore, after all these years, we've not gotten into trouble along those lines with stories, suspicions, and such. I give the man, as I stepped ashore, a little booklet of Proverbs, brand new, attractive booklet in an easy-to-read Portuguese translation. As I would return next week or in 2 weeks, whenever I'd happen to see the individual again, I'd look in a little notebook that I keep on a dashboard and see, oh, I'm such and such a bend of the river and a house on the left side or the right side, and I'd remember the man's name. I'd take a note. And I'd step ashore, and after maybe 2 or 3 minutes, I'd ask him what he's read. He might say, as they frequently did, well, I didn't read it. My kid's playing with it, and he tore it up out in the yard. Or he might say, I can't read, but my daughter or my wife has been reading it, and we've been listening as she's read it to us. Every evening we do this. When I see a response like that, or the man himself might have read it, whether it be a page or a chapter, I'm excited because I'm looking for God's elect, and I've found over the years that the elect respond immediately to the Word. When the Bible is read to them or by them, it seems to ring a bell. And these are the people I'm looking for. I'm not sending the rest of the people to purgatory or anything like that, but if I don't win them during this first 5 or 10 years on that particular river. Some of my converts might win them, and many people that I've passed up have been won later on by the converts. I'm merely looking for the first handful for me to teach, and out of that handful will grow the future Brethren Church.
We were never sorry, Bill and I, that our children couldn't go to Missionary Children's School. In fact, we were always glad that it wasn't possible because we liked keeping them at home. And because the children knew that it wasn't possible, there wasn't any rebellion on their part.
At the end of the 10 years there were congregations. The main one met at our house on Sunday mornings, some people paddling 3 or 4 hours to get there. One on the Belém-Brasília highway that has turned into the large Brethren Church in the city of São Miguel, where the Belém-Brasília highway crosses the Guamá River. I say large, they have maybe 60 or 70 baptized members, and that's large for my churches. Mine are usually smaller than this, because where we have lived out in the jungle, maybe in a linear mile along the river, there will only be 2 or 3 houses. It's not like a city where you got one house built right next to the other. So we don't anticipate a big congregation. But remember, before I ever went to sea, I was looking for an area that had people that were not evangelized. And where we find them is not in the city where the big churches are already, but out in the boonies. And we've enjoyed living out in the boonies. From there, the local pastor, one of the local converts, used to be the witch doctor's helper before he came to know the Lord. Incidentally, I didn't say that we've baptized a half a dozen witch doctors along the way. Usually one witch doctor at each one of the congregations has gotten converted and begins praising the Lord instead of praying to all of her familiar spirits. I say her, about half of them are women.
After we moved to Barcarena, which was a small town, we were close enough that they could go to the Amazon Valley Academy, a missionary children's school in Belém.
Barcarena is an island not far from where we got started, in Iquaracy, and on the first island church was out in Cuchichuba. The first church, that's the first island that we lived on, Cuchichuba. I don't think I talked much about that. But Monkey Island was the first church that actually got going. It started on Possum Island, but eventually moved across the street to the other side of the river where the majority of the congregation lived, to Monkey Island. It's in the municipality of Barcarena, where I am now after half a century. Again, this was an island that was merely farmland with a few, 1, 2, 3 cities in the far side of the island. It's about 50 miles long, the island, and nothing on this end of the island.
Right here in this town, city, I have taught Bible studies to a woman who couldn't read and to college graduates. Young women who are brand new Christians and just in their early teens, and older grandmothers. So we have such a wide age range and such a social range and educational range that one-on-one is the better way to go in teaching them, because you can adjust your lessons to their needs and their capabilities. Every place we've gone, it's been a privilege to work with 1 or 2 that turned out to be the leaders of that congregation and are able to continue and take the responsibility of a pastor's wife. Not always were they pastors' wives, but taking that kind of responsibility and teaching and training others.
The Brazilian government has built an aluminum factory on this island in the 1990s. I guess they started in the 80s, the late 80s. It's a big factory. It exports 1,000 tons of aluminum ingots per day. They've built their own hydroelectric dam, one of the largest in the world, to supply electricity for the aluminum. Ivanildo's dad, Eulálio Trindade, grew up on this island. He told the field council that the mission ought to get a missionary over there on ground floor of this new city that was going to be built. This city where we are today didn't exist in 1980. It's been built since then. All of this is jungle. Where this house is was jungle. We bought property right away, just a home already built in the town of Barcarena. We spent our time starting from zero, building a new church over in Barcarena, using the same process that we've used all along. We bought property, had our plans okayed, and built this house where we're living now since 1988. The church here is very different, the makeup of the people, than the church in Barcarena.
When we came here, there were already Christians, and others moved here from other places, particularly from Belém. Whereas all of the other places where we've gone and started from zero, making friends and then beginning Bible studies, and finally, with the Lord's help and grace, leaving a church and its leaders.
The majority of the converts, I believe, have been young people. Young people would carry these book of Proverbs, I buy them by the hundreds, to school with them, to high school. Leave them on their desk, leave them with their books. There was a time when they, at recess time, got together and read their chapter to each other, the 31 chapters in Proverbs, 31 days in a month. So they would read according to the date of the month and exchange ideas on the verse that meant something to each of them that day. The result is that we've got a beautiful crowd here of young people that are now in the university. They spend their week in the city on the mainland, Belém, and come home on the weekend, fellowship with us here. And contrary to everything one would expect, the majority of them are looking good spiritually. They correspond with us by email, occasionally write a letter. They look us up with hugs and many expressions of all sorts of love. When they arrive here on the weekend, they love us, the whole congregation does, because we're teaching the Word, and it's difficult to find a church now where the Word is taught. We don't have the biggest church in town. The big ones are the noisy ones. We're quiet. The preacher comes to the pulpit and said, well, we'll pick up now where we left off last week. Last week we were in chapter 10, today we're in chapter 11. Everybody knows that it's Zechariah, or where we're studying. And they turn there and we study together. And they go out saying, well, boy, I never understood that. Didn't know that was in the Bible. And that's what we have in mind, because that's what the Holy Spirit has promised to use.
We appreciate the fact that those who many years ago took on our support have been so faithful all through the years. We have had a wonderful privilege of staying for so long. Others have commented on how wonderful we are, how faithful we are. That's foolishness. It's the Lord who is faithful and those who have supported us. We're able to stay here because our health has been good. Other missionaries have had to go home when elderly parents became sick or weak and needing them. When our parents reached that stage, we had younger siblings to take the responsibility. Still others have had to leave their fields for political reasons. So far, Brazil is a country that has not caused us any trouble that way. And still others have had to leave the field because they didn't have the support. So our staying here has been because you folks have been faithful, and because the Lord has been faithful. And we appreciate you and we praise Him for that which He has done for us.
I suppose that's about the end of the story. We've lived happily ever after, rearing our kids out in the jungle, teaching them through high school. There's been excitement, been fun, and none of them have ever complained about being MKs. They've gotten an education that they couldn't get anywhere in the States. And if anybody is listening to this, it's among those people that pray for the Burks in Brazil, well, we thank you, and one of these days up yonder, a lot of Brazilians are going to be hugging you all and thanking you. God bless you.